This video is about the origin of some of the Afro Mexicans, some Afro Americans, and a shout out to Afro Brazilians. I know when you put an Afro on people, it means they're from Africa, but I guarantee there is more to the story and a history to go with it. This is a statue of Gaspar Yanga in Veracruz, Mexico. He's a famous Afro Mexican who might be from Angola or Gabon, or he might be of the Brand people and a member of the royal family of Guinea-Bissau. He was also named the National Hero of Mexico in the late 1800s. Here's the mystery. While I was researching Yanga, it seems like there's some confusion because here I have another source that specifically names the sources of the Mexican slaves: Angola, Guinea, and St. Thomas, which is true, but more importantly, also says enslaved Africans underwent a renaming process and were given names according to their alleged origins. This seems completely contradictory since first they were from Angola and then the alleged origins. You can cross St. Thomas off that list of alleged origins because here we find it was uninhabited before the Portuguese discovered it. So unless they brought people to Angola from somewhere else and called them Africans, that doesn't make sense. And while we're talking about Angola, I also have to mention that the slave ship from the 1619 project also came from Angola. Quick question, if Islam is not part of the West, how did the West get Arabic numerals? As far as I know, the Romans used Super Bowl letters, but by the end of the Dark Ages, Europeans have new languages, Arabic numerals, they know about algebra and algorithms, and are ready to sell the world. So what do Afro people and Arabic numerals have to do with the Dark Ages? All right, just stay with me. Here we have Ben Franklin in his book from 1755 making observations about Europeans. First, noting the Germans and Anglo-Saxons have a different complexion, and later defining that complexion to be swarthy for the countries of Spain, Italy, France, Russia, and Sweden, and finally calling them the sons of Africa and the desire to increase the white and red. So who did Ben Franklin mean when he was referring to these swarthy Europeans? And more importantly, what happened to them?
Okay, history. This is for the gang.
Who invaded Spain in the 8th century?
That's a joke. The Moors.
Oh no. I'm so sorry, it's the Moops. The correct answer is the Moops.
It's actually the Moors, and to give you a good picture, I gathered some books, paintings, and newspaper articles from the 1800s that reflect a different history that existed prior to World War II. The first new history comes from an article from 1884 in the Cincinnati Enquirer from my home state of Ohio. Here we read that Spain was the greatest foe to the Anglo-Saxons. The ancient race of Spain were called Iberians, who became mixed with the Celts and so were called Celt-Iberians. Along the coast, the Phoenicians put settlements somewhat like Carthage, and Cadiz, Malaga, Cordoba, and Seville are said to have been of their plantation. Spain was a sort of colony of Carthage with the wild people in the interior. The colony called the Carthaginians to give them military assistance, and about 240 years before Christ, the Carthaginian army, largely made up of Africans, conquered a large part of Spain and founded the city of Carthagena, which still stands. Soon after came Hannibal, who encountered the Romans in Spain, and after his defeat, Spain became a Roman province. Jews at a very early period got into this country, being driven from Judea by persecution, and the Romans assisted them to come to Spain. They became the Sephardic Jews. Here's a source from 1899 that explains the Irish Iberians and the reason why the British hated the Irish. The Iberians are believed to have been originally an African race who thousands of years ago spread themselves through Spain over Western Europe. They came to Ireland and mixed with the natives of the South and West. So if you're scoring at home, the English hated the Iberian Irish for reminding them of Spain, who reminded them of Africans. The history of the Saracens in Spain is the beginning of not only modern history, but of modern science, for the Arabs had a superior intellect to the Goths. One thing to note here is that Moorish science combines spirituality and science, while Western science lacks the spiritual backbone it should have inherited from the Moors. The story of the Moors in Spain. The history of Spain offers us a melancholy contrast. 1200 years ago, Tariq the Moor added the land of the Visigoths to the catalogue of kingdoms subdued by the Muslims. For nearly 8 centuries under her Mohammedan rulers, Spain set to all Europe a shining example of a civilized and enlightened state. Students flocked from France and Germany and England to drink from the fountain of learning which flowed only in the cities of the Moors. Women were encouraged to devote themselves to serious study, and the lady doctor was not unknown among the people of Cordova. Mathematics, astronomy and botany, history, philosophy, and jurisprudence were to be mastered in Spain, and Spain alone. In the practice of war no less than in the arts of peace, they long stood supreme. Their fleets disputed the command of the Mediterranean with the Fatimites, while their armies carried fire and sword through the Christian marches. Whatsoever makes a kingdom great and prosperous, whatsoever tends to refinement and civilization, was found in Muslim Spain. Preliminary incursion was delegated to Tarif, an officer in Tariq's army. The army landed in a place later named Tarifa in honor of Tarif. It was at this part of Tarif that the Moors levied a tax which, named from the time, became known as the Tariff. Tarif and his expeditions plundered Algeria and neighboring towns and returned to Africa with their boats laden with spoils. This result encouraged Tariq in 711 AD to lead an army of 12,000 in an all-out invasion of Spain. From the Jews and Moors in Spain from 1887, we read, "The valiant Tariq crossed with a selected force the strait between the Pillars of Hercules, which is now named after him, Gibraltariq, the Rock of Tariq. On the 24th of July, 711, 2 armies met at the river of Guadalete not far from Xeres, and after 3 days' battle, a small force of picked men, the indomitable horsemen of the desert, routed 80,000 Spaniards amidst terrible carnage. Tariq pressed eagerly forward. Cordova, Malaga, Toledo, Merida surrendered after little or no opposition. And 6 years later, the Arab Moors were complete masters of Spain and have been so unto this day. The Moors did not forget the valuable services of the Jews. The early hatred against them in Arabia for refusing to accept the creed of Muhammad had long since been converted into tolerance and goodwill. Unlike the religion of Christianity, which started as a religion of love and soon became the religion of the sword, Islamicism began as the religion of the sword, but soon became the religion of love. It was here that all 3 religions would live together in peace for centuries, and it's not even a footnote in the current version of history. Organization of education throughout the Muslim world began in the 8th century, and by the 9th, learned men in the schools of Cordoba and Spain were corresponding with learned men in the Middle East. The Greek classics were rediscovered and Aristotle came into his own. The museum at Alexandria, so long neglected, became the center of research and learning. Mathematics, medicine, and the physical sciences received fresh attention. The clumsy Roman numerals were soon ousted by the Arabic figures which we use to this day, and the 0 sign first came into general usage. Arabic words like algebra and chemistry became universal words. The Arabs, rough tribesmen as they had been at their first arrival, had softened by contact with the Andalusians and by their own natural disposition to enjoyment and luxury, into a highly civilized people, delighting in poetry and elegant literature, devoted to the pursuit of learning, and above all, determined to enjoy life to the utmost. Their intellectual tastes were unusually fine and delicate. They were moved by emotions which could only be felt by men of taste. They were romantic, imaginative, poetical, speculative, and they possessed, in a high degree, that quality of critical perception and delicate appreciation of the finer shades of expression which present day we associate with the French. Back to the Inquirer, and we get another different version of history. In this case, Attila the Hun has apparently made his way across Eastern Europe and causes the invasion of the Goths into Italy, causing the fall of Rome. This would explain the Dark Ages, since the Goths were not Roman. Later, the Goths and Romans combined to defeat Attila the Hun in the year 450. Back to the story of the Moors, where we find the Christians of the North were as unlike this as can well be conceived. Though descended from an older kingdom, the northern states had most of the qualities of new nations. They were rude and uncultivated. Few of their princes possessed the elements of what could be called education, and they were too poor to indulge in the refined luxuries of the Moorish sovereigns. The Christians were simply rough warriors. They had no idea of the high standard of chivalrous conduct which poets afterwards infused into their histories. They were men of the sword and little besides. Their poverty made them any man's servant. The Slavs. The force he employed to sustain the central power was a large standing army, at the head of which stood his select bodyguard of Slavs, or purchased foreigners. They were originally composed chiefly of men of Slavonian nationality, but came by degrees to include Franks, Galicians, Lombards, and all sorts of people who were brought to Spain by Greek and Venetian traders, and sold while still children to the Sultan to be educated as Muslims. Most of them were highly cultivated men and naturally attached to their master. Boabdil, attended by a small band of horsemen, met the royal procession. He gave Ferdinand the keys of Granada, and turning his back upon his beloved city, passed on to the mountains. There at Padul, on a spur of the Alpuxarras, Boabdil stood and gazed back upon the kingdom he had lost, the beautiful Vega, the towers of Alhambra, and the gardens of the general life, all the beauty and magnificence of his lost home. Allahu Akbar, he said, God is most great, as he burst into tears. His mother Aisha stood beside him. You may well weep like a woman, she said, for what you could not defend like a man. The spot where he took his sad farewell look at his city from which he was banished forever bears to this day the name of the last sigh of the Moor. He soon crossed over to Africa, where his descendants learned to beg their daily bread. The African garrison, who still kept their proud look, though worn and enfeebled with their long struggle and privations, were condemned to slavery. Rest of the inhabitants were permitted to ransom themselves, but on these insidious terms that all their goods should be at once paid over to the king as part payment, and that if after 8 months the rest was not forthcoming, they should all be made slaves. Others reached Africa, where they might beg a daily pittance but could find no soil to till, or France, where they received a cool welcome. The deportation was not finished till 1610, when 500,000 of Moriscos were exiled and ruined. It is stated that no less than 3 million of Moors were banished. The poor people were sent to Seville, where they were kept in servitude till the 8 months had expired, and then, since they had no money to pay the remainder of their ransoms, they were one and all condemned to perpetual slavery to the number of 15,000 souls. Let's fast forward to the history after the war, and we can see how the Moors' expulsion and enslavement is represented in La Población Negra de México. Since 1494, nearly 2,000 slaves have been brought into Castile, and Ferdinand and Isabella consented to this because they were supposedly prisoners of war. The dispersion of the Jews. Ships stood ready in the harbors to carry nearly all of the banished 300,000 Jews whithersoever it suited the captains best. Into these ships, the exiles were literally packed, crowded together without regard to sex or age, often mother torn from child, husband from wife, brother from sister, friends from friends, and separated on the coast meant separation forever. Another shipload was cast out by a barbarous captain upon the African coast, where the African savages pounced down upon them and abandoned themselves to frightful cruelties. The men and youths they sold into slavery. Nearly 150,000 souls made their way by land to Portugal, whose king, John II, dispensed with his scruples of conscience so far as to allow his greed to triumph over his creed. He granted them passage through his dominion on their way to Africa. Terror seized upon the native Portuguese Jews when they helplessly beheld the cruelties to which their Spanish brethren were subjected. They knew they themselves could not escape the wrath of the church much longer. Back to Población Negra, where we get a first-hand account of who was in Portugal. In the Portuguese capital, the same source reports 1,500 black women wash clothes. 1,000 with a basket on their heads cleaned the estuaries where the inhabitants threw household waste. Another 1,000 called black pot women carried water to homes. 400 walked the streets selling shellfish, baked goods, and sweets. 200 black men carried messages, and a large but undistinguished group of blacks was busy loading and unloading the ships. The traveler was right when he exaggerated the picture by saying slaves swarm everywhere. I am content to believe that in Lisbon they outnumber free Portuguese. From New Voyage to Italy, 'tis also a vulgar error that the Jews are all black, for this is only true of the Portuguese Jews. From the Natural History of Man from 1855 we read the Jews of Portugal are very dark. Jews, as it is well known, have been spread from early times throughout many countries in the eastern parts of Asia, in China, Tartary, and the northern parts of India. It goes on to say that the Jews in Malabar and Cochin in India are black like the other Indians, and that these are the people who eventually migrated to China. From the history of Jews, we find out that the Spanish and Portuguese Jews claimed their descent from the tribe of Judah. Same thing in Gentleman's Magazine, Double Down, Tribe of Judah. Next, we read about the settlers. The king wrestled from their parents all children between the ages of 3 and 10 of those Jewish immigrants who from poverty or otherwise had omitted to pay the capitation tax on entering or who were forced to remain in Portugal, and had them transported to the newly discovered islands of St. Thomas, which then swarmed with alligators. In 1671, about 50 years after the 1619 ship, in America's The New World, we get the explanation to the Dutch, who seemed to be curious as to where the slaves came from. They explained that most of the present inhabitants were descendants of the Jews expelled by King John 200 years ago. The earth and its inhabitants, we find that Dahomey is a place, not a person. East of the Great Popo begins the Dahomey territory. The old writers called it Judah, and its inhabitants were said to be Jews, while the neighboring river Alala, whose real name is Ephra, became the Euphrates. During the flourishing days of the slave trade, from 16 to 18,000 were annually transported from Ajuda, as the Portuguese called this place, which at that time had a population of about 35,000. While we're in Africa, according to this video from We Woke Now, as recently as 1925, Northern Africa and Israel was still swarthy. One more time in Población Negra, we find the origin of some of the Afro-Brazilians. Antonil, referring to the blacks taken to Brazil, described the characteristics of the following black nations. The artists and the Minas were robust. Those from Cape Verde and St. Thomas were thinner. Those from Angola were raised in Luanda. This last one is a shout out to Atlanta. We have the Atlanta Constitution on the origin of blue blood. After the black Moors were driven from Spain, the aristocracy of Spain was held to consist of those who traced their lineage back to the time before the Moorish conquest. These people were whiter than those who had been mixed with Moorish blood. The veins upon their white hands were blue, while the blood of the masses contaminated by the Moorish infusion, showed black upon their hands and faces. The newly converted Muslims and Jews became the new Christians who were the focus of the Inquisition. Here's an example from The Black Middle by Matthew Restall, where we have Afro-Yucatecans accused of witchcraft, blasphemy, and love magic by the Inquisition in Mexico. I warned you there was more to the story, and I hope you agree. There's more to the Mexican side of the story, but for now I'll leave it here. Thanks for watching. Share, like, and subscribe, and leave a comment if you learned something new.